Hello, LAPCS scholars. Here we are, Roads Revolution Part 2. If you have not yet seen Road Revolution Part 1, make sure you go and do that. It was yesterday's agenda. So, Roads of Revolution Part 2, 1754 to 1775. By this point, the French and Indian War was over and things were changing in the relationship between the colonies and England. So, here we are going to talk about all those details. So remember to be taking your outline notes, just like you did yesterday. And don't forget to do your exit ticket when you're done with this. Okay, here we go. The Stamp Act. What happened? Well, national debt in Britain doubled as a result of the French and Indian War. In addition, Britain needed to raise funds to support 10,000 troops that were stationed in North America for defense against Indian troubles and a possible resurgence or revival of French agitation. George Grenville, the new First Minister and First Lord of the Treasury, persuaded Parliament. Parliament is the governing body of Britain, that the prosperous and lightly taxed colonists did not pay their fair share of imperial expenses. Parliament passed the Stamp Act on February 13, 1765. It required colonists to affix stamps to over 50 different items, including newspapers, legal documents, almanacs, college lists, and even playing cards. Led by the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, outraged colonists issued a threat of violence to persuade almost every Stamp Act agent to resign. The Stamp Act Congress rejected Parliament's right to tax the colonists and called for a boycott of British goods. Boycott means that they refused to purchase them. The boycott proved to be a success. British merchants, hurt by the loss of trade, persuaded Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. Repeal means to take it away. However, Parliament also passed a declaratory act reaffirming or reasserting its right to make laws and statutes to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So even though they took away the Stamp Act, they at the same time they said, but we can do what we want. We can force them to do what we ask them to do by making laws. Parliament passed the Stamp Act in order to raise revenue, but rescinded it or took it away because of the colonial boycott. What caused the Stamp Act crisis? The Stamp Act marked the end of Britain's policy of salutary neglect. Salutary neglect is the fact that for decades, the colonies governed themselves. And then all of a sudden, this country across the Atlantic decided they needed to insert themselves, even though they had a legal right to do it. All of these colonists were so used to governing themselves, it became a problem. The Stamp Act directly affected lawyers, newspaper publishers, merchants, and planters, and these articulate and influential colonists denounced or spoke against the Stamp Act because it affected them more than it affected the regular, ordinary working people. The Stamp Act proved that it provoked a contentious or argumentative debate over Parliament's constitutional right to tax its American colonies. So, were they allowed to tax the colonists or not? The British argued that Parliament was based upon a system of virtual representation that represented the interests of all Englishmen, which includes the colonists. For example, a member of Parliament from London represented the interests of Great Britain and the entire empire. As a result, Philadelphia had as much representation in Parliament as London. However, the colonists didn't look at it that way because they feel that a representative should be from them. So not some person thousands of miles away. Somebody there on the ground. Colonists adamantly rejected virtual representation. They argued that as Englishmen, they could only be taxed by their own elected representatives. So that's a localized representative. The principle of no taxation without representation was a cherished right of British subjects, Giving up this privilege would lead to tyranny. If you don't know what tyranny is, please go look it up. That'd be a great vocab word. Why should we remember the Stamp Act? The Stamp Act crisis marked the first major event that provoked colonial resistance to British rule. The Stamp Act crisis intensified the colonists' commitment to Republican values. In this case, Republicanism is the belief that government should be based on the consent of the governed. Consent of the governed. The consent of the governed concept is extremely important to Americans. Republican values inspired the Virginia Stamp Act resolves and Patrick Henry's famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. Henry insisted that the Stamp Act infringed on colonists' rights to tax themselves. That's the thing. Colonists didn't have a problem paying taxes. They paid taxes with each other all the time to other colonies and locally, but they didn't like paying taxes that were going over to England. It didn't make sense to the colonists, even though England was the mother country. The Boston Massacre of 1770. British authorities viewed Boston as a hotbed of discontent. In other words, people who would not do what the crown wanted them to do. London dispatched troops to Boston to protect nervous customs commissioners, because the customs commissioners enforced some laws. Tensions between the townspeople and the crimson-coated regulars soon escalated. On the night of March 5th, 1770, a rowdy group of hecklers taunted a squad of British soldiers outside the Boston Customs House. A provoked soldier, provoked because the soldiers were being pelted with rocks and feces and whatever else the colonists could get, the townspeople get a hold of. The provoked soldier fired into the crowd, and when the smoke cleared, 5 townspeople lay on the ground dead or dying. Led by Samuel Adams, enraged patriots promptly branded the incident the Boston Massacre. Paul Revere's highly partisan, or very, very biased, engraving of the Boston Massacre further inflamed colonial opinion against the British. So if you look at this picture, okay, over here we see a group of British soldiers lining up and shooting the townspeople who look very innocent in this picture. And it's an early piece of propaganda where it was meant to get all the colonists to unite against the British. The Coercive Acts of 1774. On December 16, 1773, a group of Boston patriots disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded the 3 British ships and threw 342 chests of tea into the harbor. So all this tea from British ships thrown into the harbor. It would have been millions of dollars in today's money just thrown into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party infuriated British authorities. Parliament promptly passed the Coercive Acts to punish Boston for the wanton destruction of private property. Known in America as the Intolerable Acts, the legislation closed the port of Boston, sharply reduced town meetings, so people used to get together in towns and talk about community, and authorized the army to quarter troops wherever they were needed. Quartering means that British troops could sleep in people's homes, for instance. Parliament's attempt to limit political autonomy or independence in Massachusetts seemed to confirm the colonists' fear that Britain intended to restrict each colony's right to self-government. So this alarmed all of the rest of the colonies. The British strategy of isolating Boston failed. In September 1774, 55 elected representatives met in Philadelphia to reach a unified colonial response to the Coercive Acts. The First Continental Congress called for a complete boycott of British goods and urged the colonies to organize a militia or a military for defensive purposes. The Second Continental Congress began its deliberations or its negotiations or its talks in Philadelphia on May 1775. As tensions mounted and fighting spread, it assumed more of the functions of a de facto American government. In other words, it made it so that it was making decisions for all of the colonists, all the colonies throughout the land. The Second Continental Congress issued the Declaration of Causes of Taking Up Arms. This document declared that the colonists could either submit to tyranny or choose armed resistance. And we know what they chose. The Second Continental Congress authorized an army and appointed George Washington its commander-in-chief. As events unfolded, Washington demonstrated a very rare combination of soldier and statesman. And there we have it. We are about to start the Revolutionary War. So what I would like you to do is make sure you finish up your outline notes and complete your exit ticket. Make sure you share both with us, and have a good rest of your day. If you have any questions, please pop into our Zoom or send an email. That'd be awesome. All right. Thank you. Have a good rest of your day.